not very many shows can wrap things up like the way that Mushoku Tensei just did. I mean, yes, we did get the expected cliffhanger of an ending, but that wasn't what I found myself thinking about when the episode had ended. No, instead I was more so captivated by just how well the anime managed to highlight Rudeus' growth. The way they combined the memories of his past life together with scenes of the people he's helped in this new one really hammers home just how far he's come. It was a spectacular way of reminding us of everything that's happened this season, ultimately concluding with Rudeus choosing to take another step forward. Now, because most of this was original to the anime, we were unfortunately shown less of Eris, specifically the parts explaining why she decided to leave Rudeus. So that's exactly what we're going to look at here. Let's get started. Episode 23, Wake Up and One Step Forward, covering the last few chapters of Volume 6 of the light novel as well as a couple extra chapters from Volume 1 and Volume 7. The reason why this is because the anime had taken quite the interesting approach to presenting a finale of sorts. You see, rather than simply leave us with the cliffhanger of Rudeus' uncertain path towards Zenith, they instead decided to put a heavy focus on showing how he reached that conclusion. The whole flashback regarding his past life in Japan, all the way to the memory of his early years with his mother, were all events not intended to be shown here. So, for them to incorporate both anime original aspects as well as scenes that had taken place all the way back in Volume 1, well, that was actually pretty clever. What the anime had to leave out in exchange for that, though, was a much more detailed explanation as to why Eris decided to leave Rudeus. A different perspective that highlights a cascading chain of events starting all the way back in Episode 8. On the night of Rudeus' 10th birthday, it was actually Eris' mother who had made it clear what she needed to do for him. It wasn't something Eris was necessarily against, but it also wasn't something she wanted to force either. So, when the thought of her just being a reward had come to her mind, it made her think that perhaps Rudeus didn't like her the way that she did him. Perhaps he was just accepting her since her father had told him to, an assumption that would inevitably lead her to reject him. It was the moment she had left his room, though, that a whole swirl of regret began churning up from deep inside her. She began to feel as if she'd made a terrible mistake, one that may have ruined her relationship with Rudy forever. So, out of the fear of having potentially closed that door for good, Eris turned back to try and fix it. You see, even if she was only being seen as a reward, to her it didn't matter if it meant she could be together with Rudeus. As soon as she got back to his room, though, she was thoroughly shocked to see that Rudeus was the one apologizing. Clearly, things weren't as bad as she thought they were. And though she couldn't fully understand what exactly was going on, what she did understand was that this was where she had started to fall for him. Fast forward to the first few months after the teleportation incident, and what we have is a Rudeus whose demeanor has noticeably shifted, along with an Eris who is struggling to keep up with it. The devious and playful Rudeus who Eris was always dealing with back home had now changed into this massive pillar of support for her. He would never make any inappropriate moves, nor would he show any of his own suffering. He would simply stay beside her and comfort her whenever it was needed. While this did work to keep her calm, it was eventually becoming more and more evident that Rudeus was struggling too. He was just keeping it hidden so as to not make her worry about him. So, with Rudeus trying so hard for her sake, Eris wanted nothing more than to do the same for him. She wanted to get stronger so as to not be a burden for him. But because all she could do was wield a sword, there wasn't much place to help out since, well, they had Rudeus. Even so, Eris still committed herself to training. The fear of Rudeus eventually leaving her behind, combined with the feeling of being the weakest link in the party, drove her to do whatever was needed to change that. Day after day would be spent getting knocked down by Rudeus just so that a little of what he was showing her could eventually be made her own. Then, after a year of slowly soaking it all in, Eris would finally land a hit on him. It was an amazing achievement that made her think she'd finally become strong, leading her to believe that she could walk alongside Rudeus, not as a hindrance but as an equal now. Just as quickly as that confidence had come, though, it was all but completely shattered after her utter defeat a few days later. The whole year she'd spent improving her skill as a warrior was immediately proven worthless against something Rudeus had only been training with for a week. Once again, Rudeus was back on this seemingly insurmountable pedestal. Of course, Rudeus told her she possessed enough talent to surpass him, but to her that was nothing more than a lie intended to console her. To her, Rudeus was simply too far ahead to even catch up now. It was an endeavor she didn't even consider to be possible anymore. As the next few months were spent feeling as if all her efforts were pointless, it was her time in the Millis continent that had finally changed that. You see, not only did Eris learn that there were more ways to fight than with just swords and magic, but she was also able to see firsthand just how strong she'd become. After single-handedly fighting off a whole group of assassins, Eris was finally able to catch a glimpse of her own supposed talent. She still didn't think she was as strong as Ghislaine and Rudeus were making her out to be, but perhaps they weren't lying whenever they made an effort to recognize it. So it was here during this small adventure with goblins and assassins that Eris's confidence would be somewhat restored a bit. Now, as she tried her best to be of use to Rudeus after this, every opportunity to do so seemed to resolve itself before she could do anything. Rudeus would either end up taking care of it himself, or the skills she'd worked so hard to acquire simply weren't needed. It was a series of events that only went to further highlight just how great Rudeus was. What finally showed Eris just how unfit she was to be beside him, though, was that final encounter with Orsted in which she truly was completely useless. While both her and Rudeus were completely stricken by fear, Rudeus remained unaffected and had even managed to cause a bit of damage. He was able to fight back against someone who was widely considered to be the strongest in the world. Then, even after having almost died, Rudeus still prepared himself for his next encounter with Orsted. It was a nonchalant attitude that Eris simply couldn't comprehend. Yes, Rudeus was always this shining beacon of light, but now this was just a whole different level. To her, Rudeus was rapidly approaching the status of godlike. He was heading towards a place she knew she couldn't reach no matter how hard she tried. So, with the fear of Rudeus potentially abandoning her now back in full force, Eris began to keep herself close to him. She felt that if she didn't, then Rudeus would simply leave, and that was just as scary as when he had almost died. This whole confusing encounter with Orsted had brought all sorts of anxiety and uncertainty that Eris couldn't even begin to process. But even with all these incomprehensible feelings of apprehension, Rudeus was able to leave behind a single glimmer of hope for her. It was the day he finished his mission and parted ways that Rudeus would leave behind a final message, one that would renew Eris's passion to get even stronger. What Rudeus had taught her was that even though beating the dragon god was most certainly impossible, the techniques that made him so strong were created by man. It meant that what he had used to defeat both her and Rudeus was something that even she could learn. So even if it was impossible to ever reach Orsted's level, she could at least follow the same path that he had taken to get there. She now understood that there was a method behind this dragon god's mastery. Now, when we get to Eris's eventual return back home, it was the revelation of everyone she loved now being gone that led her to use her body as a means to try and keep the only person she had left. Yes, she did still have Ghislaine and Alphonse, but both treated her much more distant than how they did prior to the displacement incident. So Rudeus was really the only person she could consider as family now. That being the case, it only made sense that she would do whatever it took to make sure she didn't lose him too, even if it meant fulfilling her promise a couple years early. It was as she did, though, that Eris finally came to realize just how young Rudy was. This intimate moment with the person she loved the most forced her to come to terms with exactly what she'd been doing these past few years. She'd been so caught up in her own self-made image of Rudeus's magnificence that she completely forgot who it was she'd been relying on. Not once did she think to remember how Rudy was still a child a couple years younger than her. So, when that revelation had finally sunk in, that was the moment in which Eris knew she couldn't be with him. The fact they'd become family would always remain true, but there was no way she could ever hope to become more than that. With the way she was now, Eris knew she'd only end up holding him back. She knew she would only end up taking advantage of his kindness. That's not to say she was giving up on the idea of becoming his wife, but it also wasn't a path she'd pursue until she was stronger. Only after she could stand beside Rudeus as an equal would Eris return to start a family with him. Until that time would come, though, Eris knew that there was a long and arduous path ahead of her. If she wanted to become the swordswoman befitting a mage like Rudeus, then she knew that the first step was to head towards the Sword Sanctum. There she would follow in Ghislaine's footsteps and learn the techniques of the sword god style. Now, as for why she left with such a cryptic letter, well, that's simply because she didn't know what else to say. She did consider the options of saying goodbye or leaving a note, but she felt that those could lead to Rudeus following her. Of course, she also considered leaving without saying a word, but she also didn't want Rudeus to hate her. What mattered most here was making sure that Rudeus could move forward. So, rather than leave quietly into the night or with some emotional goodbye, Eris simply chose a brief and straightforward letter. 2 sentences which she was sure Rudeus would eventually come to understand. As we know though, Eris's letter had pretty much the exact opposite effect. Out of all the reasons Rudeus could come up with for why Eris left, the most plausible was the one where she just didn't like him anymore. To him, the past few years had just gone to show how much of a failure he was. Sure, they did make it back home relatively safe, but with all the trouble he had caused along the way, it only made sense that Eris would want to leave after. There was no way she'd want to stay with someone who was so stagnant and incompetent. That's the conclusion that Rudeus had come to. It was as he did, though, that Rudeus suddenly remembered that he had another mission, the one where he needed to search for Zenith. But unlike in the anime, there was no flashback showing a fond memory of him and his mother. It was just him remembering that he still had family to find. That said, this heartfelt scene, which had actually taken place all the way back in Volume 1, was quite crucial in highlighting Rudeus' one step forward. Though it was mostly intended to show how much Zenith loved him, the novel takes it further by highlighting Rudeus' importance. You see, not only was Rudy reliable when it came to pretty much everything, but the way he saved their family was something Zenith was forever grateful for. Had he not intervened like the way he did, then Zenith's own morals wouldn't have allowed her to stay in the same household anymore. Her upbringing as a pious member of the Millis Church would have resulted in either her or Lilia being ousted. So, when Rudy had come to play the part of the innocent child, even if Zenith did know he wasn't telling the truth, his expression was more than enough to quell her anger. Just the fact that Rudy had showed such concern for the state of his family was much more important than the mistake Paul had made. It's for that very reason that Zenith knew moments like this were only possible because of Rudy. And that's the core purpose of this scene here. It was meant to highlight the familial bond Rudy had made with Zenith, a bond strong enough to push him forward and grant him a whole new purpose. Now, everything else we see in the episode is pretty much a segue into the future arcs. The whole encounter with Roxy and Kashirika, as well as the post-credit scene with the second princess, were all cliffhanger moments tailored for the season finale. Of course, the novel does go more in depth with each of those scenes, but I'm fairly certain we were shown exactly what we needed to see. So I think that's where we're going to end it for this season of Mushoku Tensei Cut Content. If you've been here since episode 1, then allow me to thank you for all the support the past few months. Unfortunately, next season doesn't have anything as promising as Mushoku Tensei, but it does have the second season of Arifureta, an isekai that a surprising amount of you have been asking me to return to. So that's the show that I'll be covering next season. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!